now you only dropped off a certain number. You should have today's subject. Yeah, that's today. And all you need is so just write your agenda right under here. All right, great. So it is February 22nd, 2016, quarter 3, week 3. And today we are talking about the inheritance of traits. So throughout this year, we had lots of discussions, some of them about evolution. What are some traits an organism might have to better help it survive? So I'm a fish. I'm likely to have gills, two. Breathe, right? Certain kind of breathing apparatus. Also, if I'm a fish, I am likely to inherit from my parents fins, right? Right, that was a helpful adaptation. And might even my color be of a benefit to me as an individual, as a fish? What might my colors do? They might only camouflage, or they could change to what? Like some fish, like our friends the cuttlefish here, why do they change their colors? It's a whole point of the last chapter. What was the point of the last chapter? To maybe attract a female, right? So cuttlefish they can change their color patterns, right, in order to attract a mate. So we're thinking about this idea that traits are things you inherit from, obviously, your parents, and they're likely to have helped you survive or helped your parents survive, right? If there was an unsuccessful trait, they might not have passed on because your parents didn't reproduce. And if you think about inheritance, we can think about some very obvious things. So is someone willing to share maybe a facial trait they share with their blood relatives? Yes, Mr. Luna.
They have 2 eyes. I have 2 eyes.
Everyone in Mr. Luna's family has 2 eyes. Over there?
Oh, you all look the same.
What do you mean by that? More specific.
You all have like the same nose, the same eyes.
All right, and when you say same nose, do you mean like the length of the nose or the width of the nose, or? All right, so the length and the width of the nose, sure. What else, Edward? What about?
Something the same, or nose or mouth.
Like same as in size or in color or in shape, right? Do some of us have eyes that are more slanted, some more rounded, right? So there are certain facial features, right, that genetically in your family, most people seem to have, right? You know, like do you often hear folks or even yourself saying, oh, I got that from my father or blank from my mother, right?
Yes.
Right, I've got mom's ears or dad's nose or, right, whatnot. Right, so generally speaking, you can track these things and where they came from. And that's part of the nature of what we'll be looking at today. And then if someone could read our quote. Oh, we're good, Mr. Gill, we haven't heard from you yet. Yeah, go ahead. Last time. Put them here.
Scientists have found that the gene for shyness, it was hiding behind a couple of other genes.
Anyone get the joke?
No.
It was shy, so it was hiding.
That's so
You guys were slow. All right, so and you can see here we've got the usual ditty, right? So at the end of class, we'll have a chance to look at this together. On pages 4, 22, and 23, there's a little story about a disease that was genetically transmitted through a Russian royal family. And you'll read about that and answer a couple questions. And you'll be able to very effectively do that after today's presentation. All right, so let's move on.
We need colors? We need colors?
Yeah, and you'll notice there should be colors on your tables from the last class. They set you guys up. The usual Roy G. Biv action, right? All right, so.
Now you want to
Just open it together. It's frozen.
All right, great. All right, so our first word of the day, which we will highlight or underline in yellow. Is the word traits. That's really weird on the screen today. There we go. All right, great. All right, so traits. Now, at the beginning of class today, we talked a little bit about this idea of traits, right? Fish having certain traits, gills, fins, certain coloration, right? But traits are also behavioral. So this is any distinguishing, meaning what makes you or your family different than other species or individuals that are either physical or behavioral. It's based on this idea of heredity, right? That you don't just spontaneously have it, you have it because you've got it from a parent. What might be some behavioral traits you have, just because you grew up in your family in this city at this time? And it can be a very general thing that all Americans do, or something specific. Ruth, you have an example? All right, so maybe you have a family that's involved in the community, right? Like doing public service, like, you know, working the soup kitchen on Thanksgiving Day or something like that, right? So that may be something that you learned as part of your family. Because we are in the U.S., we all speak English, right? So there's a behavioral characteristic, right, that we took on because of our parents. Now, what about the way you act? For example, if you are the type that has a short temper, for example, do we think that might be based on your genes, like the way your brain is constructed, or just because you learned it from your parents?
You learned it.
All right, so some folks say learned it, so we'll re-explore that topic on the next slide. We're going to put that, we're just kind of starting to think about it right now. Right, so yeah, she's kind of having the internal dialogue. Again, we'll shelf that one for now and come back to it after you have time to think. When we talk about traits as either being, we're having a special smartboard day. It's not going to work. We talk about some traits as being dominant, and we're going to do that in green today, so highlighting or underlining or writing the word in green. And we know this word dominant in our common everyday vernacular. What is it to be dominant or domineering or have dominance? All right, clout over someone, right? So that you are the force that is stronger. Right, so again, going back to this idea of cultural traits, right? In our country, the current dominant language is English, right? So most people have to speak English, or English is forced on them, right? So, but genetically speaking, we're talking about traits that if either your mother or father has it, you will definitely have it as well, right? So one parent might have a different trait, but their trait gets covered over, controlled, or is invisible under this second one. Generally in genetics, we represent that as an uppercase letter. And part of what you'll notice with today's lecture, there should be some of a review quality to it. Folks kind of remember this from their middle school education. Anybody dominant, recessive?
Yes.
Yeah, right? So you guys have all learned this before, but because it is on your 9th grade MCAS, we are reviewing it to make sure you are proficient with the language. All right, so we have our dominant traits, our ones that are always expressed, that always cover over. Yes? Oh. We also have traits that are known as recessive, and we'll do those in orange today. So underlining or highlighting or starring these words in orange. Now recessive traits are traits that they are only expressed, they are only visible, you only see them on an individual if both parents have this trait.
Bless you.
Meaning that there's no dominant version of the trait. And you can see here we usually express that as a lowercase letter, right? These characteristics are only visible in the offspring, in the child or children in that family, if both the parents have passed that gene on. For example, it's pretty common knowledge for, in your state of adolescence, if you have a brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent, what eye color will you have? Generally speaking. Brown, right? Because brown is dominant, it covers over blue. What if your mother's mother, your grandmother, had blue eyes? What could maybe happen? You could maybe have blue eyes, right? Or maybe some mix up, right? But if the trait is there, if mom had blue eyes and dad has brown eyes, but dad's mother had blue eyes, right? You could do, and we're gonna put that together in a nice little visual thing next time we meet. But for now, we'll just have the dialogue about it. Sorry, bud. I know, I'm disappointed too. All right, so, and then last up, in blue today, we're going to have the word pedigree. So pedigree is simply a visual example of how we track traits, dominant versus recessive. So it's also known as your family tree. Does anyone have access to that? Have you ever seen like a family tree in your home where you show like the scaffold, right? And you see branches. A lot of folks in their lifetime will go on websites like genealogy.com and you can track where your family came from. Or if you're willing to part with a couple $100, you can send a swab of your cheek cells, like inside of your mouth, to a website called 23andMe, and they can, based on your genes, track where you came from, like where you're, you know, what countries or islands or whatnot your family has lived on. All right, so but either way, this family tree is a lineage. And once again, using our ELA skills here, what two words do I have in lineage?
Line and age.
Line and age, right? So we're talking about this idea that over the course of time in a line, right, over the ages, there you can chart who had what traits and how they got passed on. Typically, this is used to look at disease patterns in families. Now, in your lifetime, some really interesting stuff is going to be happening in that genetic testing has gotten really good. So I just mentioned this 23andMe idea. So as it stands, right, your grandmother could go, she could send her DNA into this company, and they can tell her how likely she is to have certain diseases, right, whether it be a mental illness or heart disease. And the political discussion happening now is, what are grandma's rights? All right, so if grandma, let's say she does this test, right, and they say that you have like a 80% chance of heart disease. Does grandma have to tell you? Or why should she tell you? All right, so you might be more likely to have it. Is grandma's privacy more important, or is your, you know, potential health more important? Like, you know what I mean? So should that information be public or private? Does grandma have the right to choose?
Yes.
All right, right, so this is something that's being discussed right now, and you guys might be voting on in coming years, whether or not your genetic information is private versus public. How could this be used against you? Let's say you have a very high likelihood of heart disease or mental illness. How could this be used against you? What is something like jobs provide to employees? One of the main reasons you healthcare, right? So yeah, this idea of testing, right? So if, let's say I'm going, you know, I want healthcare and there's a very high likelihood that I'm going to have an expensive illness, what might the insurance company do? They might not want to cover me, right? So part of this idea of privacy in terms of your pedigree, you know, it could mean that you may or may not get coverage unless you, you know, change your lifestyle. All right, and again, you guys will have some opportunities in this lifetime to vote on that. These are things happening in the Congress right now. All right, so let's move on. All right, now a major part about traits is this discussion of nature versus nurture. Right, and obviously we know what nature is, right? It's what happens in the world. But what about nurture? What is it when you are nurturing or you've been nurtured?
Feeding, caring.
All right, taking care of, caring, right? Feeding, whatnot. Right, so a lot of when we talk about behavioral traits, we talk about whether like your behaviors, your person, occurred naturally. And this is a viewpoint that most biologists believe in, which is that the genes you have, right, are going to build a certain brain, and that brain will control your behaviors. So that the person you are is who you are going to be when you are born, right? So it's already kind of predetermined whether or not you'll be the type of person who has a short temper, or is really friendly, or is, you know, really good at learning, or is really oriented towards being good at sports, like having good balance and whatnot. Right, so there's this idea that you are, you know, your genes are your destiny. You will be who you are. And how many of you have like, younger siblings or children in your family, right? And what age does that individual start to show itself? Like you start to recognize this as a person that's different than everyone else in the family. Like, does it happen like right from the time they're 6 months, like the baby's either quiet or, you know, loud, or does it not happen until way later?
I don't pay them a lot.
Well, I mean, if you have younger people, oh yeah, right. So, would we say that it's true or fair that a lot of people you start to recognize them as individuals very early on?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And are they always exactly as the rest of their family are? No, right. There can be individuality, right? So that's where this idea of nature comes through. That, you know, this person came out of the womb and they're ready to go as the person they're going to be, regardless of how they're treated or what household or country they grew up in. Now there's an opposing viewpoint, of course, this idea of the nurture point of view, and you can underline or highlight that in Pueblo, in violet. And this viewpoint more supported by psychologists or people who study the mind. And that's the idea that it is the environment, it is the community, it is the place in which you grew up and the way that people treated you that determines who you will be. Right? So psychologists assert that the environment, the place you live, and the community, the people that raise you, are the major source of your behaviors. Whether or not you'll be, a calm, kind, giving, caring, generous person, or a wild, assertive, angry, misbehaved person. Right? So this idea is in contrast here that you can take any child and put them in a new environment and turn them into whoever you want them to be based on the way you raise them. And in a moment, we're going to turn this into a four corners debatable topic. So you'll see the familiar agree, disagree things hanging around the room, as you've seen throughout the rest of your classes. And the first thing we want to assert, or you want to assert as an individual, is which camp are you on, right? Based on your experiences, based on who you are as an individual, do you believe more in the nature point of view, that you are predestined, right, from birth to act and behave certain ways based on the way your brain is constructed? At this point you can start shuffling a bit. Or are you more of the nurture point of view that it all depends on your parents and how they raised you? Right, so we have strongly agree over in this corner, so we'll start off with nature. Do you, strongly agree that nature is the way to go? Sort of agree, strongly disagree is that corner, right? So we have an opposition here, perpendicular, or not. So this is the part where the students are right, so, you believe that nature is the thing, right? Based on, the brain I have, and the genes I have, I will be a certain way. And what? Yeah, sure, and again, we have like our moderate ones, right, too, where you just sort of disagree or just sort of agree. Right, there are 64 ones. All right, great. So in this particular class, we have a very strong lean towards nature, right? So, so you guys have the viewpoint that if you were taken from your parents at birth and raised by another family, you'd still be exactly who you are today, or close to who you are today. Right? You think you'd be exactly the person you are, regardless. Whereas you guys tend to have the disagreement, right? That it's all about who raised you, how your family treated you, what values you grew up with. Let's look at another question here. All right, so let's say we have two individuals who are a little wild, a little reckless, right? They do drugs, they get into fights, they're very aggressive, and they have an unprotected copulation that results in an offspring, and they give this baby up for adoption. So the baby is raised by a very calm, well-educated couple, right? In a very different environment. Who do we think this child will be as an adolescent, right? As a teen, will they be more like the parents, their physical, biological parents, or more like their nurturing parents? So, let's see here. So, again, we have our four corners here. If you think that, the child will be like the biological parents, right? We have this side of the room, our strongly agree, or if you think it will be more like the parents that raised them, our strongly disagree or agree. And you notice we do have a bit of a migration here, right? So some people start to shift over their belief system when we have a scenario introduced. All right, and then that's our little four corners thing, so you can return to your seats, please. About these ideas. So, for those of you who believed that you kind of are who you are, you're on the nature camp of things, what kind of evidence do you have? What brought you to this belief system?
I strongly believe that the type of person that you become is because of your experiences. It's because of
So you're more on the nature point of view.
Yeah.
All right, and have you had that experience of maybe someone acts a certain way as a child, but then their parents keep pressuring them to be something different. They ultimately become what their parents want them to.
Yeah.
Like molding, right? Okay, so there's some evidence for our nurture. For those of you who are on the more the nature side of things, that like you kind of are who you are, your genes are your destiny. What?
I'm kind of in the middle, because it's like a 50-50 chance that if you're like adopted, you might act like your parents, and there's another chance that you might be the person that your parents wanted you to be.
Right.
So it's kind of...
Well, what kind of things would you definitely get from the parental household? Like what kind of behaviors or habits might you acquire?
Cleaning your room.
All right, maybe clean your room, or certain manners, right? Like they trained you to be a certain way. But what about your emotional being, right? Like,
The way you're treated.
do you think it's more the way you treat it, like, or that's kind of what we're asking with this, right? So let's, again, like we're saying that the biological parents are people that were very aggressive, very excitable. So as that child grows up, whoops, even if they've been taught manners like Jihad mentioned, right, or have, like, might they be more inclined on their own to act like their birth parents?
Yeah.
Perhaps, right? So they but again, training, temperament, whatnot. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to transition to physical traits, right? Because that's the cornerstone of what the book is going to talk about today. And if you do open your books to page 422 and 23, you'll see an example of what we're doing today, but we're going to have a previous example here that'll help out. So what I'm going to have folks do for their notes on this is initially we're not going to do any of these cross lines or the coloring in of the squares and circles. For now, just start off by drawing the squares, the circles, and the lines that connect them. So I'll highlight those things in black, right? So for now, I just want you to start off with the overall drawing, and then we're going to add a bunch of stuff to this afterwards. So just like that, those parts of it, and then we're going to fill it as we go along.
What drawings?
So again, we're drawing all the squares and the circles, and the lines that connect the squares and circles. Then we're going to break this apart bit by bit. See that Carlos is waiting for me to get him a ruler since he hasn't started yet. Would anyone else like a ruler? All right. I know some people like your lines clean. Here you go.
Thank you.
This ruler, I think you might turn up, Grace. All right, cool. All right, so again, for now, we're just starting off with our squares, circles, and the lines that connect them. So not the lines that go through them or the coloring in of the squares. We're going to do those things together slowly so we all understand what we're looking at here. And if your family has been in Boston for several generations, you can go down to the peninsula where UMass Boston is. You can go to the Genealogical Society, and they have a lot of this information, right, due to the census that's given out every year in the city. So some of you can go and you can get this chart about your family if you've been here for a few generations.
You mean if they were born here?
Yeah. Or I should say more specifically, in the state of Massachusetts. Doesn't have to be Boston, in the state of Massachusetts. And most folks are about 3/4 to halfway through the drawing. So the first thing we can start to look at are the fact that we have how many rows here of people. All right, we have 3 three rows, right? We have a row up here, these two, right? And then we have this row, and we have a third row. So if we were looking at this as a family, what would I call this row? Who are these two? Those would be the grandparents, right? So up here, right, we have our grandparents row. Right, and then down here, obviously, we have what you guys would think of locally as the parents. We're going to call this like the F1 generation, or family one, right, that came off of the original. And then, right, these are the children of those parents, right, so, and we can call that our F2 or our family 2 generation. All right, and then next up, even though the key is up here, we're going to kind of overextend the idea of what's in the key. Does anyone remember from the last chapter, what were the symbols for male and female? What did those look like?
The circle cross.
We have a circle cross who represents females, and then what represents males?
Circle arrow.
With an arrow, right? So in pedigrees, squares represent males. So let's go ahead and manipulate our squares so that they have the male symbol attached to them, right? So we'll put that arrow on top of all of the boxes, right, to just kind of drive that point home. On the MCAS, what's often asked of you is you'll be looking at a pedigree and it won't have this key. And they might say, you know, tell me about the son in the F1 generation, right? You'll have to know that the box represents the males, right? So those arrows will kind of help burn that into your consciousness right now, since we're already learned that. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, right, underneath our circles, we'll draw a cross, the symbol for Venus, and that'll represent our females. The smartboard's not well aligned this morning, so this one. So we'll go ahead and, you know, make sure to essentially, we know that the circles are females by giving them that Venus symbol. And just as a reminder, when we did our Isabella Rossellini videos, some of our animals were born with both parts. And while that's very uncommon in our species, every so often occurs, what does the symbol look like if you've got all the stuff? If you have both a penis and a vagina, and you've got two things. Do you remember what the symbol for hermaphrodite was? All right, so folks might remember from the videos we did, right? We might have both. So we're just gonna, for the sake of remembering, transform that individual, right? So they have both the male and female model there. All right, great. All right, terrific. So let's go ahead and start to use the color system from our notes. Now, what we're tracking here is a trait. And when we say someone is affected, right, this is usually in relation to some kind of disease. And most diseases, most genetically based diseases, are recessive, meaning that both, you know, you have to have two copies of it, which means all of our clear ones have which of our things? Are they dominant or recessive, our clear ones? So they have like the normal, everyday, so they don't have the disorder. So they're like everyone else, pretty much. The stronger of the two? The dominant one. So I think we used green for dominant, right? So all of the people that are clear, let's go ahead and use the green and fill them in, right? So showing that they have the dominant trait, right? It's the trait that's more common in the population. All right, terrific. And what color do we use for recessive? Orange. Our orange, right? So go ahead, and the individuals that have the trait, they have the recessive trait, we can go ahead and put them in orange. And let's go back to, in our vocabulary, at the end of the dominant and recessive sentences, I gave us a little letter code. If I'm expressing that a gene is recessive, what kind of letter do I write? A lowercase one. Awesome. Right, so what we're saying is that these individuals, they have to have 2 copies of the thing. So why don't we go ahead and we'll use that lowercase t. So we're saying that they have, these guys definitely have only the lowercase versions of that trait. And we're just going to call it trait, so TT. We're not giving it an official thing. And those of you going on the field trip tomorrow, you'll be doing an activity related to this. I also want to say that, I gave out a bunch of field trip forms for break, right, for the students who were in honors or had an A last quarter. If you do not want to go on the field trip, please let me know, because there are students who want to go, so I can give them your slot. But if you're going, we're leaving at 8:30 tomorrow morning. So you just go to your first period class, then we'll call you down. All right, so we've got our thing here. Now, neither of these individuals had expressed this thing, right? But their children all have it. So what does that mean for them? All right, one of them must have a lowercase in there somewhere. What do you notice about the pattern of this disease? Is there anything that all the individuals that have it have in common? Yeah, John.
All males, yeah.
All right, it seems to be all males. So of these 2, who do we think might be more likely? Probably the male, right? So what 2 letters would I draw for him?
A capital T.
Awesome, right? So we could give him a capital T and a lowercase t. And again, we're just kind of, we don't know for sure, but that seems to make sense based on the fact that, it seems to be something that affects males. All right, great. All right, and in reference to the MCAS, it's pretty much the most of what they will ask you. Now, down here, let's look at this example, right? So, our grandparent generation, they had this son, and he married this. Now, are either of them affected by the disorder?
No.
All right, but, all right, so, what kind of combination must he have? He must, right, so, now in order for their children to have received this, what did she have to have? All right, but since she wasn't affected, would she be 2 small t's or a big T and a small t? All right, great. Awesome, right? So what happened here, right, is mom's egg and dad's sperm. What do we call that general category of eggs and sperm? They become a zygote when it's an offspring, but before that, it's our gametes, right? So our gametes, right, dad's egg, mom's sperm, right, they formed this zygote who eventually became an individual that had the disorder. What kind of guess might you make about her? What two possibilities could the daughter be? Well, they're all T's.
Capital T,
Yeah,
All right, she could be that. Thank you. All right, she could be. All right, so she could be capital T and lowercase t. Anything else? All right, she could have gotten 2 capitals, one from dad, one from mom, and obviously, since she's not expressing, what can she not be? She can't be 2 lowercase.
Lowercase t. Oh my god, I keep saying that.
Yeah, right, so she can only be big T, small t, or 2 big T's. All right, great. I think that actually is the rest of our notes. Cool. So that wraps up our little note-taking thing. Like I mentioned, now we can launch into the activity. It's in the book. I'll leave the books floating around. It's a nice little reading activity, a quiet transition back to break. Right, so you pretty much have to read this story about this Russian royal family, answer a couple questions about it, and that'll keep you out of trouble until we do our exit card in about 10 minutes. And you can just go ahead and put these answers right on the page of notes you guys have already, if you have room. If not, you can use that piece of paper. As always, books are over there in the corner if you don't have one of your own. And I guess if it's a reading activity, obviously the room will be, should be calm and quiet, right? In an ideal world, if life is how it's supposed to be. want to believe in a beautiful, sparkling sunshine unicorn exists.